Imagine you lived in a small village 1,000 years ago. Your world was made of wood, mud, and stone. Your life was guided by the seasons and the church bell. Everyone knew everyone. And then one day, your neighbor accuses you of stealing his only cow. He has no proof. You have no alibi. It is his word against yours. What happens next? Today, we would call the police. They would look for fingerprints, footprints, and witnesses. They would use forensic science. But in the Middle Ages, none of that existed. There was no police force as we know it. There was no DNA testing. There was often just one person's word against another's. This created a huge problem for justice. How do you find the truth when there is no evidence? How do you keep society from falling apart into private feuds and revenge? Their answer was rooted in their deepest belief, God. They believed God was all-knowing and all-powerful. He saw everything. He knew the truth, even when humans did not. And they believed that, if asked in the right way, God would reveal the truth. He would perform a small, direct miracle to show who was lying and who was telling the truth. This appeal to God for a verdict was called a trial by ordeal. The word ordeal comes from an old word meaning judgment. It wasn't seen as a punishment. It was seen as a way of getting a divine answer. This formal legal procedure supervised by the local lord and, crucially, by the church. The ordeal was the final step when all other forms of justice had failed. If there was a confession, you didn't need an ordeal. If there were credible witnesses, you didn't need an ordeal. But in that murky space of your word against theirs, you turned to God. There were several kinds of ordeals. An accused person might have to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a few paces. They might have to walk over burning plowshares. Two nobles might fight a judicial duel, a trial by combat, believing God would give strength to the one who was in the right. And then there was the ordeal by water. Water was a powerful symbol. It was essential for life. It was used in baptism to wash away original sin. It was seen as pure, a substance created by God himself. This purity was the key to how the ordeal by water was supposed to work. The thinking was that this pure element would react to the guilt or innocence of the person being tested. It would become God's instrument. So when your neighbor accused you of stealing his cow, and you swore you didn't do it, the community faced a crisis. The peace was broken. The matter had to be settled. If the local court couldn't decide, they might turn to the ordeal. You would be taken to a body of water, not to be punished, but to have your soul's truth revealed. Everyone, from the priest to the peasant, believed that the water itself would deliver God's verdict. It was their ultimate lie detector. It was a terrifying prospect, but in a world with no other options, it made a certain kind of sense. It provided an answer, and an answer, even a terrifying one, was better than the chaos of unresolved conflict. This was the world that created the ordeal by water. It was a world that trusted in God's judgment more than in man's. The ordeal by water wasn't a simple dunking. It was a solemn religious ceremony, a piece of legal theater filled with prayer and ritual. Everything was done to ensure that it was a proper appeal to God, not just a random act of violence. There were two main forms, the ordeal by cold water and the ordeal by hot water. Each had its own specific set of procedures. Let's start with cold water. This was the one you often see in movies, though usually portrayed inaccurately. The accused person would first have to prepare themselves spiritually. This often involved fasting for several days. They would attend Mass and pray. The idea was to make themselves a clean vessel ready for God's judgment. This was not a punishment for the guilty, it was a test for the potentially innocent. The event itself would take place at a river, a lake, or even a large font of water consecrated for the purpose. The community would gather to watch. The priest was the central figure. He was the one who made the whole thing legitimate. He would begin with a mass, perhaps the Mass of the Judgment of God. Then, he would lead a procession to the water's edge. There, the priest would perform a long and powerful blessing over the water. He would exorcise it, casting out any evil spirits. He would then ask God to make the water an instrument of his will. The prayers were very specific. He would ask the water, as a pure creation of God, to accept the innocent but to reject the guilty. The language was vivid. The guilty person was seen as polluted by their sin, so the pure water would literally refuse to take them in. After the blessing, the accused was prepared. They were stripped of most of their clothing, partly to show they had no hidden objects to help them float or sink, and partly as an act of humility before God. Then they were bound. A common method was to tie the right thumb to the left big toe, and the left thumb to the right big toe. This curled the body into a ball, making it difficult to swim or struggle effectively. A rope was tied around the person's waist. This is a crucial detail often forgotten. One person on the bank held the rope. Its purpose was to pull the person out of the water. The goal was not to drown them, but to see what the water did. Finally, the moment came. The accused was lowered or thrown into the consecrated water. The crowd watched in silence. All eyes were on the surface of the water. Would the person sink or would they float? The answer would be the judgment of God. The ordeal by hot water was different, often performed inside or near a church. It was just as formal. A large cauldron was filled with water and a fire was lit beneath it. As the water heated, the priest would again perform a series of blessings and prayers. He would ask God to heat the water, but to protect the innocent from its scalding touch. A stone or a metal ring would be dropped into the now boiling water. The accused had to prove their innocence by reaching into the cauldron and retrieving the object. The depth they had to reach could vary. Sometimes it was to the wrist, other times to the elbow. It was an act of incredible bravery, or desperation. After plunging their arm into the boiling water, the ordeal was only halfway over. The real test came next. The priest would immediately examine the scalded arm. He would then bind it carefully with a clean linen cloth and impress a seal of the church in wax upon the bandage. This was to ensure no one could tamper with the wound, either to treat it with folk remedies or to make it worse. The accused was then left in the care of the church for 3 days. During this time, they would continue to pray and fast. On the 3rd day, the community would gather again. The priest would solemnly break the seal and unwrap the bandage. Everyone would lean in to see the arm. This was the moment of judgment. The verdict was not in the act of pulling the stone from the water, but in how God chose to heal the wound. The whole point of an ordeal was to get a clear sign from God, but the signs were not always what we might expect. The logic behind interpreting the results, especially for the ordeal by cold water, can seem completely backward to us today. In the case of the cold water ordeal, the person was lowered into the blessed river or pond. If they sank, they were considered innocent. If they floated, they were guilty. This sounds insane. Sinking seems like the worst outcome, but the theology behind it was very specific. The priest had blessed the water, asking it to accept the pure and reject the impure. An innocent person was considered pure, so the water would embrace them, pulling them under. A guilty person, however, was filled with the filth of their sin. The holy water would refuse to have anything to do with them. It would physically push them away, causing them to float on the surface. So, for the accused, the terrifying moment of being submerged was followed by an even more terrifying wait. Would their body sink beneath the waves or bob on the surface? The person holding the rope had a vital job. If the accused sank, they had to be pulled up quickly before they drowned. They had been proven innocent. They were brought to shore, dried off, and their name was cleared. Their honor was restored. But if they floated, their guilt was confirmed for all to see. God had spoken through the water. They were pulled from the water not as a survivor, but as a convicted criminal, ready to face their punishment, which could be anything from a fine to execution. The ordeal by hot water had a more straightforward logic. The judgment wasn't about the immediate pain, which was guaranteed. It was about divine intervention in the healing process. After the priest unwrapped the bandaged arm on the 3rd day, he and the witnesses would inspect the wound. If the wound was healing cleanly, without pus, infection, or festering, it was a miracle. God had protected his innocent servant. The person was declared innocent. The pain they endured was a test of faith, and they had passed. But if the wound was red, swollen, infected, and seeping, it was a clear sign of guilt. God had abandoned the sinner to the natural consequences of the boiling water. Their body was reflecting the corruption of their soul. A guilty verdict was pronounced. It's easy for us to be cynical. We can see all the ways these tests could be manipulated. Perhaps the person holding the rope for the cold water ordeal didn't pull the innocent person up in time. Perhaps some people are naturally more buoyant than others. In the hot water ordeal, was the water always truly boiling? Could a priest, for a price, bandage the wound in a way that promoted healing or infection? We will never know for sure. But for the people at the time, this was a profoundly serious matter. They truly believed God was watching and participating. The fear of the ordeal itself was a powerful tool. Many people, when faced with the prospect of being bound and thrown in a river or plunging their arm into boiling water, would simply confess. For a court, a confession was the best possible outcome. It avoided the need to tempt God with an ordeal at all. The psychological pressure of the ordeal was as much a part of the system as the physical test. It was a mechanism designed to produce a result, one way or another, and restore order to the community. The signs were there to be read, and everyone understood the language. For centuries, trial by ordeal was a standard part of the legal landscape in Europe. The church was deeply involved, providing the prayers, the rituals, and the theological justification that made the whole process work. Without the priest, it was just dunking someone in a river. With the priest, it was the judgment of God. But then, in the early 13th century, things began to change. The church started to have second thoughts. This was a time of great intellectual ferment. The first universities were being established in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Christian scholars were rediscovering the works of Aristotle and the complexities of Roman law. There was a growing movement toward logic, reason, and more systematic ways of thinking about the world. This new intellectual climate began to influence theologians and church leaders. They started to question the very basis of the ordeal. The main theological problem was it, right, for humans to command God to perform a miracle. The ordeal was essentially a demand. It said, God, stop what you are doing and show us a sign, right here, right now. To many influential thinkers, this looked a lot like the sin of tempting God. It was putting God to the test, something the Bible warned against. It seemed arrogant and blasphemous for a humble priest to command the elements on God's behalf to determine the guilt of a suspected chicken thief. This growing discomfort came to a head in the year 1215. Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes in history, convened a major church council in Rome. It was called the Fourth Lateran Council. Bishops and church leaders from all over Christendom attended. They made decisions on a huge range of topics, but one of the most consequential was a short, simple decree. Canon 18 of the council forbade clergy from participating in any trial by ordeal. Priests were no longer allowed to offer the blessings, the prayers, or the rituals that gave the ordeals their divine authority. The church officially withdrew its support. It was a stunning reversal. The institution that had been the guarantor of the ordeal for hundreds of years now declared it illegitimate. The impact of this decision was enormous. It pulled the rug out from under the entire system. A lord could still order a man to carry a hot iron, but without the priest's blessing, it was no longer a judicium Dei, a judgment of God. It was just a pointless act of torture. It lost its legal and spiritual meaning. This left secular rulers and local courts with a massive problem. Their ultimate tool for resolving impossible cases was gone. What were they supposed to do now when there was no evidence and no confession? This crisis forced them to innovate. They had to find a new way to determine guilt and innocence, one that relied on humans rather than on God. The solution they gradually developed was the ancestor of our modern legal system. Instead of asking God for a sign, they began asking people for a judgment. They started to rely more heavily on sworn testimony and on gathering evidence, however limited. Most importantly, they developed the concept of the jury. They would gather a group of local people, men of good repute, who were likely to know the accused and the accuser. This group, the jury, would listen to the case and then give a verdict based on what they believed to be the truth. The transition was not immediate. It took decades, even centuries, for the new systems to take hold everywhere. But the Fourth Lateran Council was the turning point. By banning priests from the ordeal, the Church unintentionally spurred the development of rational, evidence-based legal procedures. They forced the courts to stop looking to the heavens for answers and to start looking for them here on earth. The age of the ordeal was coming to an end, and the age of the jury was about to begin. The official, church-sanctioned trial by ordeal faded away after 1215. The courts of Europe moved on to juries and judges. But the idea of using water to reveal a hidden truth was too powerful to disappear completely. It lingered in folk memory, and a few centuries later, it came back in a twisted and much darker form. This was during the great witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. This period, often called the early modern era, was a time of intense religious upheaval and social anxiety. People were terrified of the devil and believed witches were living among them, making pacts with demons and causing all sorts of misfortune, from failed crops to sick children. Accusations of witchcraft were common, but proving it was nearly impossible. How could you prove that someone had secretly met with the devil? There were no witnesses. It was a classic legal problem that the ordeal had originally been designed to solve. And so, in this climate of fear and paranoia, people reached back for the old methods. They revived the ordeal by cold water, but they called it swimming a witch. However, this was not the same as the medieval ordeal. The differences were critical. First, it had no legal or religious legitimacy. The church had long ago condemned it, and while some local magistrates might turn a blind eye or even participate, it was not part of the formal justice system. It was often little more than mob rule, a public spectacle driven by fear and suspicion. Second, the ritual was stripped of its solemnity. There was no mass, no fasting, no solemn procession. There were no official prayers blessing the water and asking for God's judgment. The accused, usually a woman, would be dragged to a pond or river by an angry crowd. Third, and most cruelly, the logic was perverted into a terrible no-win situation. Like the old ordeal, the accused was bound, often thumb to toe, and thrown into the water. The old belief that pure water would reject the impure was remembered. If the woman floated, it was taken as a sign of guilt. The crowd would howl that the water, being a pure element of God, was refusing to accept such a vile servant of the devil. She was then pulled out and typically executed, often by burning. But what if she sank? In the medieval ordeal, sinking meant innocence. The person was quickly pulled to safety and freed. But in the witch swimming, this was not always the case. Sometimes the sinking woman was still considered guilty. The mob might reason that the devil was trying to hide his own by pulling her under. More often, a sinking verdict simply meant that the accused drowned. She might be declared innocent after she was already dead. It was a test that was almost impossible to pass and survive. This dark echo of the ordeal shows what happens when a formal, if flawed, legal process becomes a tool of popular prejudice. The medieval ordeal, for all its strangeness, had a structure. It had rules, it had a theoretical path to innocence. The swimming of witches had none of that. It was an instrument of terror, a public performance designed to confirm a pre-existing belief in someone's guilt. The story of the ordeal by water and its grim afterlife and the witch trials tells us a lot about the human search for certainty. We have an intense need to distinguish good from evil, guilt from innocence. In a world without the tools of modern science, people found other ways to get answers. They looked to God, to miracles, and to the very elements of nature. Today we look to DNA, to fingerprints, and to the judgment of a jury. Our methods are more rational, more scientific, and hopefully more just, but the fundamental desire for a clear verdict, for a way to make sense of crime and conflict, remains just as strong. The ordeal was their answer, born from a world of faith, fear, and a desperate need for the truth.